What if your house was on fire, but when you called 911, no one on the other end of the phone could understand what you had to say? Suppose there was an emergency and you had to take your son or daughter to the hospital, but when you got to the emergency room, you could not communicate where or why your child was in pain. Imagine for a moment that a hurricane or natural disaster was headed your way. You could tell that the neighbors were packing up their house, but you couldn't understand where to go or what to do. In all these instances, individuals were eligible to receive a benefit, program, or service, but they could not access them because they could not read, speak, write, or understand the language. Every day, millions of individuals in the United States face similar barriers because they are limited English proficient, or LEP. These are individuals who do not speak English as their primary language and who have a limited ability to read, write, speak, or understand English. According to the American Community Survey of the U.S. Census Bureau, 55 million people in the United States speak a language other than English at home, and 24.2 million speak English less than very well and would be considered LEP. Today, we will discuss the obligation that every federal agency has to ensure LEP individuals have meaningful access to programs and activities. My name is Lorene Laglagarin, and I'm an attorney at the Federal Coordination and Compliance Section in the Civil Rights Division in the Department of Justice. I'm joined today by my colleague, Mike Muley, also an attorney at the Federal Coordination and Compliance Section in the Civil Rights Division at the Department of Justice. We're here to review and discuss the Attorney General's recommitment to implementing Executive Order 13166, improving access to services for persons with limited English proficiency, and how the executive order affects federal agencies. We wanted to walk you through the essential elements of effective language access program planning, based largely on our office's experience implementing and enforcing Executive Order 13166. We'll start off with the legal obligations, then we'll talk about self-assessment in federal agencies, and then finally, we wanted to talk about our approach to language access program planning. Mike, shall we start off with the legal obligations?
Executive Order 13166 was issued in August 2000 with two mandates. First, that each federal agency develop and implement a language access program by which limited English proficient persons can meaningfully access agency programs, services, and information. Second, that each federal agency providing federal financial assistance issue a guidance to recipients of their legal obligations to take reasonable steps to ensure that LEP persons have meaningful access to programs and services based on the non-discrimination provisions of Title VI of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and its non-discrimination regulations. The focus of this presentation is on the first legal obligation, that each federal agency develop a language access program that ensures meaningful access to agency services by LEP individuals. In his February 17, 2011 memo, Attorney General Eric Holder asked each agency to recommit to implementation of Executive Order 13166 by undertaking several action items.
Mike, so what exactly did the Attorney General ask federal agencies to do?
Among the action items, each agency was asked to conduct an inventory of languages most frequently encountered and identify the primary channels of contact with LEP community members. Also, each agency was asked to establish a schedule to periodically evaluate and update agency LEP services, LEP policies, plans, and protocols. Agencies were also asked to identify LEP contact situations and take the necessary steps to provide meaningful access. When developing hiring criteria, agencies were asked to assess the need for non-English language proficiency for positions in the agency. Fifth, when discussing written translation, agencies were asked to standardize the terminology and streamline the process for obtaining community feedback on the accuracy and quality. Lastly, agencies were asked to establish a language access working group responsible for implementing the federally conducted provisions of Executive Order 13166.
That actually seems like a daunting task, establishing a language access working group, hiring criteria, written translations. where do I start if I was a federal agency? Where would I begin?
Lorraine, one place a federal agency could start would be completing a language access self-assessment. A self-assessment can help an agency determine if it communicates effectively with LEP individuals and can inform the language access program planning process. The Language Access Assessment and Planning tool available at www.lep.gov approximates the elements that are part of effective language access policy directives and implementation plans. These elements, included in the self-assessment, include, first, understanding how LEP individuals interact with your agency. Do they call? Do they come in person? Do they send an application to the office? Do they access your website or communicate by electronic or regular correspondence? Second, the tool is used to identify and assess LEP communities. This is a number or proportion of LEP individuals from each language group in your service area, those who are qualified for programs and services, and the systems you have in place to track their primary language information. Third, providing language assistance services. Effective communication with LEP individuals requires appropriate language assistance services to be in place and available to staff. There are two primary types of language assistance services: oral, in the form of bilingual staff or an interpreter, and translation, which is the replacement of written text from one language into equivalent written text in another language.
That's actually an important distinction, Mike, that oral, that's interpretation, and translation, that's written. I often get that confused, so it's good to distinguish those two pieces.
It's really important that an agency understands the distinction between both those types of language assistance services. And also, it's important that the agency has training in place for staff to explain those types of concepts.
What about staff training?
Well, staff who interact with the public should be trained on policies and procedures for identifying the language needs of LEP individuals, accessing and providing the necessary language assistance services that we just talked about, working with interpreters, how to request documents that need to be translated, and tracking the use of these services when they're needed. Lastly, providing notice of language assistance services. Informing LEP individuals of their eligibility for benefits, programs, and services, and the availability of language assistance services is key.
So what you're saying with community outreach then is not only do federal agencies have to advertise to LEP communities about their programs and services, they also have to say, hey, we have language assistance services so you could access those programs and activities.
That's right. And when they provide this notice, it needs to be in the languages of those communities.
That makes sense.
Providing notice only in English is not very helpful to someone who speaks a non-English language.
So during the self-assessment, are there any other issues to bear in mind?
Well, other issues to think about during the self-assessment is really how your agency has reviewed or assessed its current language access policies. It's very important that an agency monitor, evaluate, and update language access policies. So it assesses how it provides language assistance services, whether they're effective or not, and ensure that the staff are trained on how to use those services. Also, it's important to see if the policies, procedures, and the plan need to be improved or changed because of changing needs. So each element of this self-assessment really helps an agency identify the items that need to be addressed by a language access program. And a language access program, as we're describing it, includes a language access plan, policy directives, and procedures.
As Mike described earlier, the Attorney General's recent language access memorandum specifies that each agency should establish a schedule to periodically evaluate and update agency LEP services and LEP policies, plans, and protocols. For some of you, updating your plan will not be a problem. But we also know from the GAO report on language access that implementation of comprehensive language access programs remains uneven through the federal government. This inconsistency is one of the reasons why the Attorney General would like federal agencies to recommit to Executive Order 13166. When thinking about agency language access programs, I find it really helpful to step back and look at the overarching goal. How, as federal agencies, do we communicate accurately and effectively with individuals who are not proficient in English? Think about the three scenarios I talked about earlier. In updating our own policies of the department, we found it useful to return to the idea of How do we make this meaningfully accessible to an LEP individual? Our thinking has evolved from our office's experience in enforcing Title VI of the Civil Rights Act. We've provided technical assistance and have helped courts, jails, law enforcement, and other federal agencies go through the process before you now. And through our experience, we think key elements include strong and clear language access policy directives. That's the purple slice of the pie. An overarching language access plan for your entire agency. That's the green slice of the pie. And finally, underlying procedures that inform and reflect both the policy directives and the plan. That's the blue slice of the pie. And though we've presented distinct wedges, policy directives versus plan versus procedures, it's helpful not to get too stuck on our terminology or even the order we proceed. I think that's part of the reason why we chose arrows. You'll find that when you actually sit down and think about what your federal agency does, and when you actually write your agency's policy directives and plan, some procedures may become a part of the plan or vice versa. We've created these concepts and this visual to really get you thinking about the groups or collection of ideas that you'll encounter moving forward.
So Lorraine, what are policy directives?
Well, actually, policy directives are the foundation of any language access plan. Typically, the plan as well as the procedures usually flow from the policy directive.
Okay.
A policy directive actually includes operating principles and guidelines that govern the delivery of language-appropriate services, including expectations for how the agency and its staff will function, and how and when staff will be trained on policy contents, many of the things that you alluded to in the self-assessment.
So, is this just one statement? What does it look like?
Well, actually, it's a series of statements. It's an overall policy directive can have a variety of different sections. For example, it often begins with purpose and authority.
Okay.
So, for example, the purpose of this policy is to establish effective guidelines consistent with Title VI of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and Executive Order 13166. This description provides the legal basis or administrative authority for the agency policy. An overall language access policy directive can have all other elements, including a general policy statement. I think of that as the theme.
Okay.
Information that describes who has to comply, that's generally staff compliance. And then finally, language assistant measures. This defines acceptable methods of communication with LEP persons and can provide guidance regarding requirements for data collection, notice, or training.
So Lorraine, it sounds like you identified a few parts there. Do you have an example of what one of these looks like?
Absolutely. This is the general policy statement. It describes the overall goals and expectations of the agency. I like to think of this also as when. Here we note that it's provided in a timely manner. Next, we find out who the effective staff are with respect to the agency's language access policy. Here, all personnel are responsible for ensuring that the agency provides free language assistance services to LEP individuals. We've gone over the when, this fulfills the who. And finally, language assistance measures. I think of this as the what. We know it to be timely, we know who will provide it, but what is it that we're providing? Here we find out that all personnel shall provide free language assistance services to LEP individuals whom they encounter or whenever an LEP person requests language assistance services. They also will inform members of the public that language assistance services are available free of charge to LEP persons and that the component will provide these services to them. The overall language access policy directives can also have a definition of terms. On the screen, you'll see a few suggested terms: bilingual staff, qualified interpreter, FFA, to define in your language access policy directive. This can be helpful so that all sections or divisions within an agency have a shared understanding. In this visual, you'll see the language access policy directive depicted as the large rectangle. This is the overall language access policy directive. But when you start to write your policy directives, you may also find it necessary for your agency to develop standard policies with respect to staff training, human resources, procurement, or translation. These are the smaller connected rectangles. For example, you might find that you need to develop standards or rules with respect to recruiting, hiring, assessing, promoting, and retaining bilingual staff.
The Language Access Plan is a management tool that provides the administrative blueprint for bringing the agency into compliance with language access requirements. The plan describes how the agency will meet the standards described in the policy directives, including how the agency will address the language services and resources needed and identified in the self-assessment we described earlier. It includes several key elements. First, the identification of persons charged with implementing the plan. A plan should describe the management staff, work group, committee, or other agency personnel involved in the language access plan. The plan should also detail the chains of command for authority and oversight and explain any coexistent responsibility and coordination with other agencies, divisions, or offices.
Yeah, I know actually some agencies have actually found it helpful to appoint a language access coordinator or other personnel to implement the language access plan. Ideally, the language access coordinator should be or report to a high-ranking official within the agency. I think this is useful because it's really senior management within an agency who can better coordinate procurement, human resources, and the policy department, all of whom are part of a language access plan.
A plan also describes how the agency will provide notice of language assistance services. Earlier, we provided several examples of outreach methods.
So, I know that a lot of agencies have approached us and said, you know what, I don't think we really need to create a plan because we actually don't have interactions with LEP individuals. What would you say to those agencies?
Lorraine, one of the things I would say to those agencies is to just think about one question. Does my agency interact with the public? If an agency is interacting with the public, there is a potential to interact with an LEP individual or LEP communities in their service area.
So think about interaction with the public.
And when you think about interaction with the public, as you said before, there are many LEP individuals that the agency would have to communicate their services and programs and benefits to.
Got it.
A self-assessment of the number of current LEP individuals that currently interact with your agency also might underestimate that. Some agencies rely on how many interactions they receive with LEP individuals now to determine if they need to provide language assistance services. This is not always an accurate representation of the need for those services in the service area.
That's a good point.
Now, when language assistance services are not readily available, there are many consequences. An LEP individual may not seek out the agency, may not seek out programs, benefits, or services they are eligible for, and they also may not provide beneficial information or file complaints. They might not have access to critical information that they need that's provided by your agency because language assistance services are not available. Now, you talked about community outreach before. Many agencies will have to develop or improve current outreach processes to ensure that they're reaching and addressing the needs of LEP individuals. And outreach, like we said before, includes the notice of free language assistance services.
So what are some examples?
Some examples of outreach include notices, and this can come in many forms: translated signs in conspicuous locations in the actual agency office, notices translated into non-English languages available on the main page of the website of the agency.
But what if someone can't read?
If someone can't read, agencies can also do things like provide audio notices. For example, some agencies provide non-English notices on the telephone menus of the agency phone lines when an individual calls into the agency.
Oh, so that way the information's still conveyed to someone who can't read it, for example.
That's right. Some agencies actually have a system where print documents that are sent to the individual in non-English languages have a number that the individual can call, and they can hear a recording of the contents of that.
Oh, that's smart.
Of that information.
That's quite smart.
The other piece, which is important, is really the training of staff on policies and procedures. It's not enough for an agency just to write and have it on the books and it's put away. A plan is only as effective as the people who are there to implement the plan. And staff need to be trained on the procedures and policies that the agency has. And now, an effective plan will describe how and which staff will receive this training.
And interpreters, translators, and bilingual staff, they may actually have a different training depending on their role in the agency and what they're asked to do.
Right, because interpreters and translators in an agency have different responsibilities with communicating with LEP individuals. Identification of funding and procurement issues is also a very important part of a plan. This can often be overlooked by an agency, but it's really key to providing appropriate language assistance services. We all know that agencies have to exercise discipline when it comes to resources, but when resources are spent on language assistance services, we have to make sure that it's spent on quality services.
So you're actually talking about value for your money spent.
Each agency wants to make sure that when they spend money on language assistance services, they get a quality, effective form of communication as the result. Now, this can come in the form of contracts with vendors, of ensuring quality and accuracy both in the interpreter services and in the translation services, and building quality controls through the procurement process can really be an effective part of a language access plan.
Yes, I think procurement is something often overlooked in the language access plan, so it's great that you're emphasizing it.
It is great, and it also could be a place for cost savings with certain vendors that are used by the agency repeatedly. A plan should also have a description of the time frame and the objectives and the benchmarks for the work that needs to be undertaken for the items identified in the plan.
But what if there's a change? So for example, if a federal agency suddenly finds themselves servicing a lot more Amharic speakers, or if there's demographic change that maybe augments or minimizes the amount of LEP people accessing their services, what happens to the plan then?
And this is true. This is what happens every day. Things change, the communities change, and that's why it's really important a plan has a section devoted to monitoring, reviewing, and assessing current language access policies and procedures. It may be necessary to change policies and procedures based on demographic shifts or changes in the LEP communities that are being confronted by agency staff. And that's why a plan is a living document. It changes as the needs of the service area change, and also to meet the needs of the agency itself.
As discussed earlier, a plan should determine the number or proportion of LEP persons from each language group that they encounter when administering the agency's programs or activities. The plan should also detail systems for data collection and management.
And the last part of a language access program is what we call procedures. In the illustration here, it's the blue slice of the pie.
It's the final slice.
It's the final slice of the three that we're talking about today. A language access procedure is the detailed explanation that specifies the steps to be followed by staff to implement the plan and the language access policies.
So if you go from the theme, that's the policy directive, that's the overarching goal,
right,
and then the plan tells you who's involved and the overall picture, but when it comes down to the nitty-gritty, that's the procedures, right?
The procedures are really the how-to for the staff.
Got it.
They explain things such as how to provide language assistance services, how do we gather data, how do I deliver services as a staff person and information to LEP individuals when I encounter them?
So the procedures, for example, would answer the question of what am I supposed to do if I pick up the call and someone's speaking in Chinese, and what should I do? Those procedures would explain that what to do next, right?
That's exactly right. And they'd be included in regular training materials and procedures for that staff. Everything from stickers on staff phones describing how to access telephone interpreter services to procedures for conducting criminal investigations of LEP individuals.
Thanks for explaining the procedures. So we recommend tailoring this framework to your agency's mission, the population served, both their language needs and the cultural context, the importance of the service provided by the program, and finally, available resources. Thank you so much for joining us today, and we hope you found this information useful. Good luck with your language access policy directives, plan, and procedures.